So you want to build an app, but don't know where to get started. I'm going to give you 3 tips plus a bonus tip at the end to walk you through the process of building your first app. The first step is going to be to determine what type of app you want. Do you want a web application or do you want a mobile app? Or perhaps you want to build a web application that also works as a mobile application, also called a progressive web application, or PWA for short. So once you determine, okay, is this going to be a web application or is this going to be a mobile app? Is this going to be desktop software? Is this a game that I want to build? That answer right there is going to influence what framework and languages you want to learn. Now, if you already know programming languages, then you might be able to stick with those. And if you don't, you're like, what languages do I need to learn to build an app? Well, depends on what type of app you want to build. JavaScript, however, is typically a pretty safe bet because you can use that for front end, for back end, for mobile apps. I mean, JavaScript can handle a lot of the work. Now, it's not my favorite language. I actually prefer Python for back end work. I prefer like server side work. I typically use JavaScript for front end and like web applications and mobile apps. If you have a complex web app, you might want to switch to using the source language for Apple and Android. So for Apple, that'd be Swift, and for Android, that would be Kotlin. And so if you have a really complex or huge app idea, you might learn those directly instead of using JavaScript or one of those languages. JavaScript, Flutter, all of those are languages that are built on top of these source languages. So you have like Kotlin, Swift, and all those, and then you have JavaScript and Flutter and all those up here. So they're higher level languages. So if you have a web app you want to build, my recommendation is simply learn JavaScript. Learn JavaScript, HTML, CSS. That'll get you front end, back end, the whole shebang, the whole package deal right there you can do in JavaScript. Now, if you want to go scalable, large web applications, my personal recommendation, and a lot of people will disagree with me on this, is to learn Python for back-end stuff. Python is great for machine learning. You can integrate it into web APIs and web apps and build out even full web apps with Python using Django. And it's just such a powerful language, and it's just beautiful to write. So my recommendation, if you want to build like a scalable, larger size web application, go with Python for the back end. A lot of people say, oh, you can use JavaScript, you can use Node.js and Mongo. That's true, you can. A lot of people do. And Node.js is great, but I personally would recommend Python. You'll get quite a bit further in Python, in my opinion. Also, MongoDB, everybody uses MongoDB as a database, but MongoDB has a lot of weaknesses, and I see people out there trying to build these massive, complicated databases with Mongo, and that's just not what it's built for. So be careful when you're learning a language. Determine what type of apps you want to build, and pick the right languages for that specifically. Don't just learn a generic end-all, be-all language and just use it for everything. If you want to build a mobile app, on the other hand, I would recommend, obviously, okay, so mobile apps, you might have just the mobile app and you don't need a backend, and that's totally fine. If you need a backend, again, I recommend Python, Django for an API type setup. For the front end, it depends on what kind of mobile app you're building. If this is going to be a really simple kind of throw it together, launch it, or even an MVP for a company, React Native is great. There's a couple other tools like React Native. I think Flutter is a pretty popular one. There are a lot of those types of frameworks that work really well for building mobile apps, and that would be my recommendation. If, like I said earlier, you're wanting to build the next big, huge Uber or one of those applications, you have the time, you have the funding, you have the investment available for that, then go straight to learning Swift, go straight to learning Kotlin, and just write them natively. I mean, it's going to be your most efficient, fastest running, best formatted code app. Step number 2, determine your most important features for this app. What is the core of this app and what are the most important features? And start there. So if your most important feature is, hey, I have this app and I need to use Bluetooth to connect to this device so I can make something happen, your first step should be building an app that can handle the Bluetooth connection. Build the Bluetooth functionality, build it out, and then build it around that and build out from that. I see a lot of people who just start building from A to Z, and they start, oh, I got to build a mobile app. Oh, I need a login screen. I need a home screen. I need these menus. and then all of a sudden they get down to this big, huge feature and they realize either I don't know how to do this or this isn't even a possible function and I just wasted all that time. Also, if it's your most important feature, you should simply be building around it. Everything should encapsulate that feature. So my recommendation, find your most important features, build around that. If you have an app that requires a heavy backend, like a backend server to handle some heavy lifting, build the backend server first, get it working, then build the front end or the mobile app to communicate with it. Step number 3 is plan your UI, UX before you even start building. The UI is user interaction, UX is user experience. So you want to design the flow of your app, you want to design the user experience, you want to design the whole designs, the layout, the colors. All of that should be mapped out either on paper, in your mind. You should hire out somebody to design it for you, whatever the case be. There should be some idea of this is how I want the app to work together before you start building the app. Don't just start writing code because it's just so inefficient and you're going to waste a lot of time. You're going to get frustrated when things aren't looking the way you imagine them to look. So plan out your UI, UX, plan out your designs, plan out the functionality before you start building the mobile app. Now, some functionality, some ideas come after the fact, after you've already started building. That's totally fine. You can add those to it. But your main app ideas, whether it's a web app, a mobile app, whatever it is, should be fairly well mapped out, fairly well planned out. The other reason that helps is because it allows you to really map out what features do you really need to implement? What do you need to build out? Do you need users to be able to log in? How are you going to handle that? Do you need to store data on the user's phone? How are you going to handle that? What kind of data do you need to store? What format does that data need to be in? All of these questions end up getting answered in my experience primarily in the design phase, where we're designing the layout, we're designing the wireframes, we're mapping out, hey, this button goes here and we'll handle this. And oh, if that happens and this needs to happen, so we need to add this feature down here. And it happens so often where clients come in and they have something built, and then all of a sudden they try adding all these features, and it's like, well, none of those are going to work the way this is designed. So design and plan the features and the designs and the layout, even the colors and the fonts, like have it all designed. It'll make the build process so much smoother for you. And that's whether you build it yourself or have a company build it. I personally, for my clients, typically require that they hire my UI UX designer to do a full design of the application, whether it's a mobile app or a web app, before I even start writing code. And that's not to make me money. I actually typically don't make money on that process. I do that so that way there's a clear vision of this is how it should look, this is how it should function, and typically there are a lot of functions that end up getting missed until the design phase. Bonus tip, do your research before you start implementing functionality in your app. 2 reasons. First of all, some functionality that we dream of and think of isn't actually possible. I know we like to say, oh, anything's possible now. There are some things that just aren't as possible right now as they may be in the future. And so you want to research the features that you want to add to ensure that they're going to be possible, especially within the framework you choose. So if you choose React Native, make sure that you can implement this feature with React Native before you start writing code. So a couple years ago, I took on a client who wanted this feature implemented into an app, and I was like, oh yeah, this is totally possible, not a problem. And I go to actually implement it, and I realized there was a feature that I couldn't in the end actually build out because it required a third-party tool that wouldn't let us use it because our app didn't quite qualify, and I had misread and misinterpreted some of those qualifying statements. And so I had to go back to this client and say, hey, I know you thought this was a big feature for this app, but we're going to have to build the app without this feature. And that ended up causing a rift between us a little bit. So my recommendation, whether you're building an app for yourself or for other people, do your research before you implement any sort of code or functionality. The other reason for that is this. It absolutely sucks to build out a platform, to build out an app using a framework like React Native, only to discover that the feature you want can't be done in React Native, but it can be done in, say, Flutter. And then you realize I have to rewrite this entire application in this other language to implement this functionality I want. So that's why research is key for any mobile app. Do your research, pick out the right language and frameworks for what you want to build, and start with the important features. Build out the important features first, and everything else gets built around those.